This is petty of me, and I probably shouldn't admit it out loud, that I was disappointed that he mentioned Ukraine in his speech only because I felt like it gave Prince Harry credibility in Ukraine by saying it so closely to Harry going to Ukraine and doing that another fake royal engagement. Hi, all. Kinsey Schofield here. Welcome to Kinsey Schofield Unfiltered, live from DC. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by my dear friend, Hugo Vickers. He's the author of Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, which is available to purchase right now. Hugo, I know you've been watching all of the videos that are being fed back to the UK about this special relationship, this relationship between our two countries, the relationship between our two leaders. I guess a general reaction to the trip so far. They're in New York today, so they have not necessarily wrapped up, but we've seen some of the bigger events that we're going to see already.
Yes, well, all I can tell you is that over here the reaction is incredibly positive, and everybody feels the King has really pulled out all the stops and produced an amazing speech at Congress yesterday and an entertaining one in the White House at the banquet, and that it's all going very well. And the reason I would suggest for this is that really our King and I suppose I should also say Prince William are about the only two people in this country that President Trump respects in an unqualified way. So they are the right people to do it. I mean, he is absolutely the right moment. It's the right moment for him to go in and, cement the special relationship, pour oil on any troubled waters that might be around. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's amazing.
Let's talk about the different puzzle pieces that are going on here, because realistically, this plan for this state visit happened months in advance, the suggestion that this take place, likely Trump looking around Windsor saying, I need to do this for him too. I like this experience. Let me recreate it, or something to that effect. But we're all talking about the special relationship being in jeopardy because of some tension between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and President Trump. So, a lot of the commentary in the States is here comes King Charles to mediate the situation, but that wasn't the ultimate objective at the beginning of this trip, was it? What was the ultimate objective, in your opinion, when this plan started to develop?
Well, what I would say is that when the king goes on a state visit, it is theoretically not a political move, although, yeah, we know it has a lot of political implications behind the scenes. It's essentially a diplomatic move. As you say, I've just written a book about the Queen, and when you look at what she did when she went to places like Russia and China and Ireland, to Germany and Japan after the war, what she was doing was cutting a path, opening the doors, smoothing things down, so that then the politicians and, let's face it, also the businessmen and people all followed. So essentially, we must bear that in mind, that it's meant to be a diplomatic move by the king. And so I think, I mean, what was so wonderful was that President Trump was very keen to come over here on the two occasions when he met the Queen at Windsor and then his state visit in 2019. He was extremely well entertained by the King in the autumn last year. And so, yes, you're right. This is a return hospitality, if you like. And although things, of course, in a fast-moving world are changing literally daily, almost by the minute. And there are all sorts of implications and all sorts of things that other people say and other things that happen. Nevertheless, it's a really good thing to show that the two countries, can rise above the small differences of the moment and take the long view. And, we're talking about 250 years and, even further back, perhaps. So I think it's all a good thing. And I think, I did wonder whether the king would actually make it out to Washington, because for a long time we weren't given a date, and his health is not brilliant, although he looked in fine form yesterday. I think that's what it's all about, really, and I think it's been good, and it cannot but do good.
I agree with you. Talk to me about, because you work with me pretty regularly and you know that there's a lot of US interest surrounding Harry and Meghan. And I have said to a couple of people that I felt like it was really important that the king introduce himself to Americans, and maybe that speech in Congress was a way for him to do that. Here are my morals and values. Here are the things that are important to me. Here's what I pray for. I mean, a lot of intimacy in that speech. For the last 6 years, Harry and Meghan have been trying to define not only the king, but the monarchy in their own words. And prior to that, I feel like Americans' public perception of Prince Charles was an affair and was tabloid headlines. So, how important was this trip to King Charles when it comes to establishing in America and, in a sense, the world, because all eyes are on this event, who he truly is and who he wants to be known as?
Yes, I think that is important. I mean, you're in Washington. You're in Washington at the moment. So, has there been much talk about Harry and Meghan? Because over here, no, there's been nothing. And luckily, they're rather sidelined by all this because, of course, he is the head of state. He is the important person. And there he was in Congress, as his mother had been before in 1991. And, and that's what it's all about. So, I think it's a good thing that they are rather in the background at this point.
I will say, and this is petty of me, and I probably shouldn't admit it out loud, that I was disappointed that he mentioned Ukraine in his speech only because I felt like it gave Prince Harry credibility in Ukraine by saying it so closely to Harry going to Ukraine and doing that another fake royal engagement representing I don't know who, big tires around the corner. Earl's Big Tires. Nobody knows who Harry's representing anymore. But that's just me being very petty, Hugo, and I acknowledge that.
Well, no, I think, it's a fair point, but I'd like to sort of counter it a little bit by saying, that the king has always, all the way along the line, and Prince William, both been very supportive of President Zelensky. And it was quite brave of him, I think, to bring up Ukraine when you think of the way that President Trump treated Zelensky in the White House, not that long ago. That was kind of not very nice. So he was prepared to tackle those issues and stand by what he felt was important. And so I think I didn't think he was thinking about. I don't think he even crossed his mind what Prince Harry was doing. And frankly, actually, I'd rather forgotten that he was going to Ukraine. So let's face it, we need to concentrate on the really important issues. I mean, there's a big, Ukraine has been going through enormous suffering, and the king doesn't like it, and the king said so.
Uh, I've been overwhelmingly pleased with the tone of this trip based on the incident that happened over the weekend at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. This entire trip could have been gloomy. This entire visit could have had, just a different tone. But
Yes,
the Kings
yes.
acknowledged the incident multiple times, and still this trip feels so uplifting and positive.
Well, I think that's again what it's all about. I mean, there've been several examples in history, thinking the times like when Mrs. Thatcher was nearly blown up in Brighton in 1984. There are times when, and when all the household cavalry horses, for example, were blown up by the IRA, the message has always been, we'll not let acts of tyranny deflect from the overall most important things that are going on. So the king represent, as you say, he mentioned it certainly, and I think it's great that it shows that the president and the king can come out regardless. I mean, there was even some discussion in the press over here. Inevitably, would the king be going on account of that incident? Was it safe for him to travel? Well, of course he was going to go, and actually you will find, and I could give you many, many examples of royal families, they treat the fear of assassination as a kind of distant occupational hazard. They are not going to let it stand in the way of their more important duty of getting on with the affairs of state. And had he cancelled it on account of it, it would have shown what a terrorist could achieve, and that would have been awful.
It's a very good point. Yeah, I'm thankful that there was an officer injured, but none of the figures that this individual was going after, he didn't get any of those figures. So I'm grateful that everyone seems to be okay. But still, with such a scare, they could have somebody could have just had a bad attitude, and nobody's got it. Everybody seems so positive, and it's just been great to watch the way that, I mean, it's the definition of King Charles, really, this resilience we've seen throughout his cancer battle. And he even said at the dinner, at the state dinner, keep calm and carry on, joking about that phrase that's on all of the tea towels. That really is the definition of our two countries right now, which is admirable.
Yes, and don't you think that the fact that this visit has taken place and that we're all talking about it, and there are lots of wonderful images, and the welcome was very impressive, and the banquet was impressive, and the Congress was impressive, that pushes these sort of incidents with terrorists sort of off the front pages and back, where they belong into sort of into the past, and we move forward, which is really important.
It is important. Now, there has been some criticism I've seen on your side of the pond regarding the King's speech to Congress. Was it too political when he talks about diversity being a great strength, when he talks about NATO or some of these topics that are clearly a challenge to the current president's way of thinking? Um, I saw some commentators in the UK saying this is Downing Street crossing the line, or they had too much influence over the speech. What's your takeaway?
Well, I think it's a very good point that the king does have to be very careful about not getting into the political arena. What you can be absolutely certain of is that although the speech will have had a lot of input from him, particularly in the style in which he delivered it, it will certainly have been approved by the Foreign Office and Downing Street. They will know what he was going to say. And so, therefore, I think, that kind of makes it all right, if that makes sense. And he's made his views on all sorts of these issues quite clear before. And it would, in a way, have been quite strange if he hadn't mentioned them. I mean, I think, yes, you can certainly say that, he took the president on one or two things where he disagrees with him. But then they all sat down for dinner together in the evening, and so maybe both sides are kind of relatively happy about it. It'd be interesting to see what happens after he goes home, whether President Trump suddenly comes back with something and changes his views or, you know, emphasizes something in a different way. That'll be interesting. I mean, rightly, we know that President Trump and Keir Starmer don't get on. But over here in Britain, Keir Starmer's not in a very strong position. He's been, even as all those events were going on yesterday in the House of Commons, they were debating whether he should be, held accountable for the appointment of Peter Mandelson, which is an ongoing issue. And then we have local elections here, council elections on the 7th of May. And endless commentators are saying, well, that's when he goes, so let's see what happens.
It's so true. And that also is a great example of the monarchy's importance in a scenario like this because they are
Yes.
consistent. Prime ministers and presidents come and go, but the monarchy is consistent, and that stability is incredibly important and it's comforting.
Yes, it is, and I mean, the Queen herself used to say, that she thought continuity was very important, and I've always upheld that. And if it should be, I mean, I don't want to get into domestic politics too much here, but if it should be that Starmer goes, it'll be very reassuring to know that the King is waiting to deal with whoever the Labour Party produces as the next Prime Minister, because it is the role of the monarch to support his Prime Minister, especially if he's been elected by the people. That's
That's
what they do. Yeah.
something interesting for us to watch. Can you tell me some of your favorite stories about the Queen's relationship with presidents? And when I was preparing for the Palace and the President's documentary, you were such a great source for me. So thank you again for some of the stories you shared with me throughout that process. But when you think about special moments between the royal family and American presidents, what stories stand out to you?
Well, there are quite a few. Of course, most recently, of course, it was very enjoyable. But I know somebody who was at, I think I probably said this to you before, at the state banquet for President Trump. And as the Queen began to say, sort of she remembered her visit to President Truman, which was just after the end of the war. He began to look more like a little schoolboy, and she began to look like a schoolmistress, and she could always pull out that card because she went back so far. She met Mrs. Roosevelt. She met all the presidents. She also did meet Lyndon Johnson, though not when he was president, but she did meet him. I think it was when St. Lawrence Seaway was being opened, or sometime 1959, something like that. She met him. Um, she found that President Eisenhower. She told Anthony Eden that she thought he talked too much. I think that at the state banquet in for President with President Ford for the bicentennial in 1976. A great moment was when Bob Hope was performing, and he said in his jokey way, "Priests are having a very hard time at the moment. Nobody goes to confession anymore. They go straight to the Washington Post." And that, of course, was a direct reference to Watergate and what had happened only a couple of years before. So there have been some good moments, and they've been much enjoyed. And I was rather impressed when the King mentioned that he'd been to America 20 times, on various visits, right back to when he and Princess Anne went to see President Nixon, way back in 1970. So, he goes back a long way too. He can pull those cards out of pull those rabbits out of the hat when he needs to.
Well, that's right. And it's my understanding that he's had an acquaintance at least with President Trump since the 1980s due to Trump's, running in those entrepreneurial circles that have always attracted Prince
Yes,
Charles, now King Charles.
yes, yes, exactly. So, he knows the nature of the beast.
Can I ask you if we were to judge this trip based on Monday and Tuesday alone, what one of your standalone moments would be, or how you think history will remember this trip so far?
I suppose that what impressed me was, and it interested me very much, was the 12 standing ovations in Congress. I mean,
I know.
those,
I could not. I was like, this guy has never had to pause so much in his life. You could tell he was like, okay, I'll pause, you
yeah,
know?
absolutely. He doesn't get that sort of attention over here always. And, they were listening to him and they were leaping up to on their feet at every possible opportunity. It was actually became quite funny, I thought. But I think yeah, that will have boosted his morale a lot as well, I think, because I think, he pulled that speech off. He delivered it well. He has good delivery. He has good timing, and he knew what he was saying. And by and large, it was, well, I think pretty much universally well received in the chamber.
Well, and you can tell me if I shouldn't have said this, but when we have spent time with him and I said, "We love you in America," he was like, "Do you?"
Well, he does, how can I put it? Let me put it in a slightly different way. The Queen, Prince Philip, and Princess Anne never cared a jot what people thought about them. They just got on with the job. That was one of their great skills.
Mhm.
He is different. I think he does need reassurance. And I think I know a protection officer who saw him not that long ago and said, "You're doing a very good job, Your Majesty." And he said, "Really? Nobody ever tells me that." Well, uh, everybody needs a bit of a boost from
A high
time.
five.
Yeah, exactly. And he certainly got that from Congress. So I'm sure, will be returning home after the Bermuda trip, a very happy man.
My favorite part was when the president told an entire audience and the world that his mother had a crush on him when he was younger because he did not, you just saw his body language shift. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like it was very sweet. It was a very charming moment.
Yes, yes. Well, they obviously, you know, get on well together. Certainly they can pull it off anyway in public. And I mean, people have talked a lot about, President Trump himself said that he said the Queen thought that he was the favorite president of all the presidents she knew. And I was asked about that, and by Susan Page. I think you did a talk with her, didn't you? Or you
You and I talked about it, yeah.
talked about that. And I said, well, I think she probably sent every president home thinking they were the favorites. But I think when he came to Windsor that time, and he certainly stayed longer than he was meant to, I think she was probably fascinated to have the opportunity to examine this particular head of state and, contextualize him, if you like, with all the other heads of state that she'd met over the years. It must be part of the fun of the job.
I agree, yeah. Well, Hugo Vickers, what you actually go through a lot of these stories in Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History. So if you're able to get your hands on a copy, look online, you can secure that. But you, in great detail, go into a lot of these sweet stories about the Queen engaging with other world leaders and just how what a valuable asset she was to the world, and what a valuable asset she was to the world. And I do think, based on what I've seen here in DC and this trip, that King Charles is a valuable asset to the world, and the monarchy is too.
Oh, certainly. And the great thing about the monarchy, we've talked about continuity and things, is that, he goes out there because, in a sense, he's invited and he's told, yes, you must go. We want you to go out. He's going out on behalf of Britain. He's not going out on behalf of one or other political party. He is above politics. He's certainly above party politics. And, he's a diplomatic head of state, and he's had a lot of experience. He's met, he met Eisenhower, he met Churchill, he's talked to all sorts of people over the decades. And this is very valuable. And, he can be a sort of calming influence and take a long view. I mean, he certainly took a long view yesterday. He looked back over the history, did he not?
Yeah, well, I one last question before I let you go. There will be some people frustrated by his comments on faith. Do you have a reaction to that?
Not particularly. It's again one of the things which he is very keen on. He did actually state very clearly that he was a Christian, and as you know, he is head of the established Church of England in this country. But like his father, indeed to some extent like his mother, he's always been very keen to investigate interfaith relationships and things like that. He's criticized sometimes over here. For example, he didn't put out a message at Easter to our church, and I think he said something to the Muslims or something like that. Sometimes he gets criticized for that. But, as it is one of his things like climate change, which we know President Trump doesn't agree with him on, I didn't think there was any harm in him mentioning it, and I think it was done very lightly. Did you find there was a lot of criticism? That interests me rather
Um,
about.
I was nervous the second he said it because I have been covering the conspiracy theories about him converting. I've been trying to stop the conspiracy theories about him converting to Islam, or
He's,
are I know, thank you. I don't believe that either. I'd like for those rumors to stop. But some people used the example of acknowledging Ramadan and not acknowledging Easter. He did acknowledge Easter. He was there with his family, the Prince and
oh,
Princess of Wales. They all were at St. George's Chapel. He acknowledged the Easter holiday. So I was an instinctually I was concerned when I heard and it's like you said, it's very gentle, it's very quick, the comments about faith, because I knew that the people that were already fired up about that topic, this was gasoline on an open flame.
yes, well, maybe. Has it proved to be, do you think? Or
Hmm,
has it passed by?
I don't think I'm sleeping enough on this trip to be able to answer that question now.
Uh,
Let me get
I
home.
Yeah, perhaps next time we talk, we can have a look and see what we thought the reactions were. I
Yeah.
mean, there were quite a lot of, by the way, a lot of comment over here because I stayed on afterwards to watch things like Newsnight and things, about whether he was going to be meeting the so-called Epstein
Oh,
victims,
yeah.
and they were all over the place, and they got a lot of traction in the media, rather more than perhaps they should have done. I don't know. On a
Well,
visit.
I'm sure you know this argument. I think I've had to say this a couple of times on television in the last week. As the way that you prosecute people in the UK is it's basically the king versus, not the people versus, like in the United States. So if he were to meet with anyone associated with the Jeffrey Epstein saga while he was over here, that is the potential to jeopardize an active investigation, numerous investigations, according to some, between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor sharing government secrets with Jeffrey Epstein and some of the more salacious allegations against Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but he could potentially jeopardize an active investigation. And why would he do that?
Well, absolutely right, exactly, and he has to keep out of it. But I just was interested, where you were talking about, the sort of the reactions and what the media were saying over here. That certainly was one of the things which came up.
And how are they not shutting that down? Shouldn't they know that if he were to meet with anyone or see anyone, that I mean,
You you have a more charitable view of the British press than I do. The British
that's very
press,
funny.
the British press likes to stir things up, and the trouble is, of course, if it gets hits, then that gets more. That's why they go on talking about those Montecito couple, because it gets hits the whole time, and so people think, oh well, people want to read about it, they want to hear about it, so we'll do more.
Mm.
It's the world we live in, I'm afraid.
Thoughts and prayers. All right. Well, agree with us, disagree with us. Let us know in the comments below. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend. Hugo, so fun to pick your brain about such a historic moment that we shared together just very, very far away.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing you again very soon.